Hello, students, or maybe I should say good morning. At least it's morning for me, about 6:15 a.m. I'm on campus, lights are still on. You can see Hefner Hall right there. This is the video lecture that I'm doing for the Mendich textbook, second edition of the Mediated World, the chapter about movies. I think it's chapter 11. Chapter 11. This is an image from the textbook, photographed by a guy named Muybridge. I think I'm saying his name correctly, not a name that shows up often in conversation. But the photographs were taken to settle a dispute between two gentlemen. I imagine these gentlemen were having this dispute while they're drinking brandy and smoking cigars. In my mind, that's the way I've pictured it. The debate is this is in the 1800s when a horse is running, is there a moment, a second, a split second, when the four hoofs of the horse are off the ground all at the same time? And to settle this great question, Muybridge took a series of photographs. Here we have the images right here. But what Muybridge also got into was this concept of persistence of vision. When you show still images very rapidly to the human brain, the brain is going to like fill in the gaps and create the illusion of continual motion. And that's the way motion pictures work. When we're on film, you'd see 24 frames a second. That was the standard that the industry came upon. 24 frames a second is how you would create a moving image with film. Before we had films per se, there was the phenomenon called the magic lantern. Okay, magic lantern. This is not in the textbook, but I did want to throw this in. You could take images, paint images on a glass slide and project these images in a theater. And by having different glass slides that sort of moved in front of each other, by moving the glass slide, you could create motion on the screen. So people had seen moving images on the screen before. I just want to stress that, whenever we think about something being new, in almost every case, you can peel back the layer of the onion and discover there was something before that was pretty similar. So magic lanterns kind of helped pave the way for cinema. But they were, a far cry from actual motion pictures, but there was this phenomenon of the magic lantern. Now we have, this is from the textbook, we have Thomas Edison. Someone else had developed a camera that could take 12 frames per second. And then Thomas Edison develops this device, the kinetoscope. Again, I hope I'm saying that correct. Not a word that shows up often in conversation. The kinetoscope shows 12 frames per second, and people could watch sort of very primitive moving images by looking in like a little peephole. It's not projected on a screen yet, but you could look in a peephole and see these images. The camera that Edison was using was incredibly cumbersome. I think the textbook says it weighed 500 pounds. So it really wasn't very portable. The earliest film from Edison's equipment, Edison's era, was called the Sneeze, or Fred Ott's Sneeze. You can find this on YouTube. It's only a couple seconds, 6 seconds or 8 seconds. But that is actually, a moving image recorded in 1894. Now in France, the Lumiere brothers have a much smaller camera that's truly portable, and they go around and they start recording things. They call them actualities. Actualities. That's what the Lumiere brothers. And these begin to be projected now in sort of cabarets and theaters and cafes and things. So now we get kind of the beginnings of motion pictures as a distinct form of art. Just the very, very, very beginnings of it. There's a very famous film made by the Lumiere brothers of a train pulling into a station. The first films, when films began to be shown, at first they didn't have distinct theaters. They were kind of shown in vaudeville houses or music halls, along with live musical acts and things like that. The first ones were silent, all black and white. They did not have a way in the 1890s and early 1900s to record sound at the same time that they were recording film. So they were silent films. A guy named George Millet was a French magician, and his stuff is pretty amazing. His stuff really is kind of amazing. He was using cinema as an extension of kind of his magic act. And if you think about it, just for a moment, it's kind of remarkable. He couldn't just like go to YouTube and look up, how do you do a special effect? How do you make someone's head come off their body? How do you make someone's head enlarge to fill up the whole screen? He figured this out on his own. And the stuff that he made is actually still kind of clever and still looks amazing. And it must have really, really impressed audiences at the time. And he is also responsible for what is considered to be the first international movie hit, A Trip to the Moon. A Trip to the Moon, which is also, probably the beginning of science fiction cinema. In 1903, Edwin Porter directs The Great Train Robbery, which is considered to be a true milestone and the beginnings of cinema as sort of a narrative form of art. It's also considered to be the first American Western. It's got a couple of other firsts here listed on the screen. The first time we use a title card, put words on the screen to help the audience understand what's going on. You have non-continuous action and parallel editing, shooting from different perspectives. All of these things we take for granted now because we've grown up watching films and TV shows. Like it just seems second nature to us. But in 1903, you had to kind of teach the audience how to understand what they were watching. They had to be taught that, when it goes from one scene to another scene, a cut, it's actually, the same story. We're just seeing a different point in the story or a different vantage point. So this is what The Great Train Robbery introduces. And this image here on the right, very famous part of the movie, a guy holding up a gun, pointing the gun at the camera and firing. I've read that that little portion of film was shipped separately than the rest of the film. So the projectionist could add that at the beginning or the end, which I think is pretty interesting, that the projectionist is the one deciding, where this famous scene, where it would be in the film. Now we start to get the beginnings of movie theaters as maybe y'all understand them. Nickelodeon was a term that was developed because many of these places charged only a nickel to watch the movies. And you get the beginnings of major studios forming, Paramount, Universal, MGM. Those are just a couple of them. They controlled the production and distribution of films. Now, when one company controls different phases of production of the same product, we're talking about film as a product here, we call that vertical integration. So MGM would make the movie and then also own the theaters and control the distribution. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. 1915, Birth of a Nation. This film is highly controversial today. Although I do think, it warrants a place in this lecture and warrants a place in the textbook. But it's pretty offensive by today's standards and probably by any standard. It's a positive portrayal of the Klan. Yes, it is a positive portrayal of the Klan. But this was a film that's over 2 hours long when other films are just 10 and 15 minutes long. This kind of establishes that you could tell a very long story and an audience would sit through a very long story. First film ever shown in the White House. So that's a, historical milestone right there. Whenever this film is screened again, people want to do a revival or sort of do a historical screening, it attracts protest, and it did attract protest even in 1915. Okay. Mindich stresses that even at the time, there were people who said, whoa, this is totally not acceptable. Another film. Now, this film also, if Birth of a Nation has a really controversial and kind of strange racial message, Jazz Singer does as well. Okay. That's Al Jolson, a famous singer on the right there. In The Jazz Singer, he's a blackface singer. Blackface was sort of a now defunct form of art where white people, and sometimes African Americans as well, would sort of adopt this sort of gross caricature, putting black makeup on their faces to perform oftentimes songs about wonderful life in the Old South. Anyway, The Jazz Singer has some sound that's recorded and it goes with the film. There's some dialogue, including, wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet. In the textbook, it kind of gives the impression that The Jazz Singer was the first sound film. That's not entirely true. There was many people experimenting before 1927 with techniques for recording sound on film. This was the first film that's very successful, and the technology was, I wouldn't say perfected, but it at least got to a point for widespread dissemination. And you had a number of films that started to adopt the technology, and then the term talkie was developed to differentiate a film with sound, music, and synchronized dialogue as opposed to silent films. One of the unfortunate consequences of adding sound to film was the decline of foreign cinema. Now, if you think about that for a moment, if a film was silent, you could take a film from Sweden, Russia, Germany, wherever, show it in the United States and vice versa, and you don't have to change much. Silent films did oftentimes have title cards, and you could change the title card. When actual dialogue is recorded, it's much more difficult to redub that and transport that to a foreign country. So I think, many people like sound in film. I love sound, but the decline of foreign cinemas may be an unfortunate byproduct. The Hays Code was a system of self-censorship named after a gentleman whose last name was Hayes. Early films had kind of a bad reputation. Anytime a new technology is new, it oftentimes causes this kind of moral panic or concern among the status quo, the people who didn't grow up with that thing. And with film, it was a concern about men and women, including young men, young women, mixing together in a dark theater, oftentimes in a crowded urban environment where a lot of immigrants were. And so that kind of had an unsavory, seedy reputation. And then people were concerned, even in the 20s, people were concerned about some of the things being depicted on screen. So the Hays Code comes in, and this is self censorship. The industry did this to itself to prevent government or Congress from coming in and trying to impose censorship. And they came up with a whole list of rules about things that you could and could not do. If you showed someone living a life of crime, they had to be punished. I've seen some old gangster movies where there'll be a warning on the screen of, we're going to show you the life of Al Capone, but it's a cautionary tale. We're telling you what not to do, very clearly saying, hey, this is a criminal, but he's a bad guy. And then certain things could also not be shown, like abortion couldn't be mentioned, homosexuality couldn't be mentioned. Both of those subjects were featured in films made before the Hays Code. So it's kind of unusual, at least to our modern sensibility, to see a really, really old film where they're talking about something like that. Or, Charlie Chaplin has a gag about someone shooting up with heroin. That kind of stuff was in films a long time ago. And then Hollywood, for a couple of decades, tried to clean that up with the Hays Code. The studio system we refer to as an era of Hollywood lasting a couple of decades. I mentioned some of these studios before. I mentioned that they, had vertical integration. They owned the theaters and also owned the production. They also had people working for them under contract, including actors and then the crew, directors and the costumers and sound people. And you could crank out films factory style. Now, that sounds like a pejorative. That sounds like a negative way to talk about the creation of art. If you were, say, a script writer or did costumes, you just kind of given an order. Hey, we're doing a jungle film. 2 months later, you're doing a pirate movie. 2 months later, you're doing a detective movie. 2 months later, you're doing this kind of movie. If you're constantly working, if you're working all the time, nonstop, you could make like 7, 8, 10 films a year. If you do that for a couple of years, you're going to get very good at your craft, whatever your craft is. Listen to me now. Whatever your craft is, you're going to get very good. And so oftentimes when the magic was right, captured lightning in a bottle, you had the right combination of actors and crew, the right story, you get these incredible works of art. So there's these unbelievably good films made from the studio system. Also some pretty mediocre films. B films were ones that the studio knew was not going to be good. They devoted less money, less effort to it. So the term B movie denotes something that, hey, we know it's not going to be so great. And if you're a movie theater owner, you don't have any choice as to what film you're going to put in your theater on a week, because the studio that owns you is just giving you constant product. Okay. The studio system begins to decline in 1946 because of a Supreme Court decision where the Supreme Court said this type of tightly regimented vertical integration was an unfair restraint on trade, not quite a monopoly, but a monopolistic practice. So they kind of broke up, and that movie theaters weren't owned by the movie studios anymore. It took a while for the studio system to collapse, but that's what caused that, a Supreme Court decision. The studio system is already suffering. Then we get this big challenge from TV. Now people can watch moving images at home. This debate, the war between film and television, is never going to go away. I don't think films are ever going to go away, because I love the social experience of going to the cinema, and I think enough people do to make that industry going to have a long, long lifespan. But in the 1950s, film responds to the encroachment from TV by making the screen wider. Televisions used to be, now televisions have a big wide aspect ratio, but I remember when television was more square. So if you have a film that's very wide, like a sort of a rectangular aspect ratio. You couldn't even put all of that onto a TV screen. So that was one of the things that films did is, hey, we're going to make our films wider. They also experimented with 3D films. This was kind of a short-lived fad in the 1950s. I mean, we have 3D films now, but the ones from the 1950s are considered kind of cheesy, kind of hokey. If you like Mystery Science Theater, if you know what that is, that kind of, silly, old movie kind of thing. You also had sort of these trends which might seem opposite, but they make sense. You have films being made now for adults, which much more adult themes, thinking that, kids might be sitting at home, little kids watching stuff at home, but the adults want to watch something more nuanced and subtle. Westerns become much more complicated in their subject matter. You have some sort of serious ruminations about the nature of revenge and vengeance and what that does to the human psyche. I love Westerns, but Westerns start to get a little bit more complicated after TV comes around. But then you also get films going after the youth market. Okay. After World War II, teenagers became a distinct kind of audience that now the film and music industry and radio as well, now they want to target this audience. Teenagers aren't working in factories anymore. Teenagers now have money. The phenomenon of the teenager really doesn't go back before the 20th century. Okay. Teenagers are kind of like a modern or semi-modern phenomenon after World War II. They're treated as a distinct audience. Now you have films going for that audience. Now, the standard, now I'm giving you an incredibly broad brushstroke history of cinema history. But the notion is that after the studio system fell apart, there's this sort of period of confusion. And then the 1970s, people had to figure out how to work within this new environment that is Hollywood. And people say the 1970s was the best decade for cinema because you had so many classic films that came out in the 1970s. If you are a film buff or you want to be a film buff, I would encourage you to take this list and watch all of these movies. And what's interesting now that I look at this again is that some of these movies, there are still sequels being made, right? We're still seeing Star Wars movies. We're still seeing Rocky movies. This blows my mind. They're still making movies Rocky. Now it's about Apollo Creed, but it's that same overall franchise. And I'm pretty sure they're still making Alien movies. Yeah, the original Alien's great. And Aliens, the first sequel, that's good too, but they're still making these movies. Here we have the from a site called Box Office Mojo, top grossing films. This is talking about theatrical distribution and money that was made in theatrical distribution. Avatar, almost 3 billion, 2.9 billion. And then we got Avengers Endgame. These are kind of big blockbuster spectacles. And many people, myself included, like these blockbuster spectacles. But many people also say that Hollywood puts too much emphasis on these things and that it would be okay to make more smaller art films. For the cost of making one Marvel movie, you could make 5 or 6 smaller films. Why not gamble on that? But anyway, this is the way of the world. We put all our eggs in one basket and make these big blockbuster spectacles, and people keep going to the movie theater. However, there's something very kind of flawed about this metric because the cost of movie theater tickets keeps going up. It doesn't seem fair to compare something made decades ago with something that was made in the last 10 or 15 years, right? When you adjust for inflation, the top grossing film of all time is something called Gone with the Wind, made in 1939. It's been released and re-released many times over subsequent decades. And if you adjusted for inflation, 3.4 billion. Gone with the Wind is the most profitable movie of all time when you adjust for inflation. Okay, that's the big caveat. When adjusted for inflation, Gone with the Wind, which, like the other films I've mentioned, is kind of maybe somewhat controversial today. It's a positive depiction of glorious life in the Old South before the Civil War. Okay. Now, here's some other things I felt necessary to put in relating to issues of diversity and representation. Whitewashing is the term that this practice still goes on, but luckily it doesn't go on, or fortunately, it doesn't go on as much as it used to. You have a white actor, and white actors could put on a little bit of makeup, adopt a horrific accent, and play any kind of ethnicity because whites can do anything. That image on the far left is Peter Sellers, pretty funny comedian. In that particular film, he played a South Asian character, still considered quite offensive. The image next to him, Mickey Rooney. This is a quite grotesque and horrible Asian stereotype from Breakfast at Tiffany's. And then that's Gerard Butler from the film Gods of Egypt. It's set in Egypt. Why would you not hire maybe Egyptian people to play the characters? They hired white actors to play these characters. And then the last image there on the far right is John Wayne, very famous Western actor who made a number of spectacular films. I mean, I'm saying John Wayne did make some great films. This one where he plays Genghis Khan, not one of the better films. And if you did a historically accurate film like Genghis Khan, you wouldn't hire this big, tall, white actor to play the role, right? The Bechdel test is not a scientific test. This was not dreamed up in some university graduate seminar. This comes from uh, a comic or a graphic novel um, about women and named after the woman who came up with this concept. And it's a brilliant concept. I've later, read some interviews with her where she said, had I known that my Bechdel test was going to be so famous, I would have maybe put more time into it. This was just kind of like a one-off gag she puts in this comic that she's drawing. The concept is a movie passes the Bechdel test if it has at least two women who have names, okay? At least two women in the movie who have names who talk to one another about something other than a man. Doesn't seem like a very high standard to meet, but believe it or not, many films do not pass the Bechdel test. They may have some women characters, but everything in the movie revolves around a man. I'm thinking now of the film The Martian with Matt Damon, which is a good film. I like the film. Has a number of female characters in it, including characters who have pretty prominent roles, scientists or heads of spaceships or things like that. But everything in the movie revolves around saving Matt Damon. So I'm not even sure if The Martian, which does have a number of women in it, would even pass the Bechdel test. So, if you're interested, you can Google that, find that site. And it is kind of remarkable how many films don't pass such a basic test. Mindich talks about world cinema. And, I could probably do an entire lecture on this stuff, but I'll just try and like touch a couple of points here. We, or at least many people in the United States, only watch films made in the United States, but that's putting blinders on. There's films made all over the world. India makes a great many films. The film industry in India is often called Bollywood, named after Bombay, where the industry is located. Used to be called Bombay. Now the name has been changed to Mumbai. But if you take the B from Bombay and then Hollywood, combine it, you get Bollywood. These are films made for South Asian audiences or for audiences from the South Asian diaspora, including people like my wife, who's South Asian, born in Karachi, raised in the United States. Not every film set in India is a Bollywood movie. I have an issue with that. When people say, oh, I've seen Slumdog Millionaire. No, that might be an homage or a nod or a reference to Bollywood. Slumdog Millionaire is not a Bollywood movie. I'm talking about films made in India for local audiences. The textbook also talks about Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, which is way before the time for you students, but I do remember when that came out. There's, just like no end to the number of awesome Asian films you could see. And then you also have this phenomenon where films from other countries are influencing each other. I love this genre of Western called spaghetti Westerns. Began in the late 60s, went through the 1970s, where Europeans, including a lot of Italian studios, not just Italian studios, but a lot of Italian studios, are making movies to copy American Westerns because they wanted to show them to audiences in Europe and almost like fool them into thinking it was a Western from the United States, but it's something made in Italy or maybe made in Spain. They've got a weird sense of humor. People throw dynamite, people popping up out of coffins. The sort of the standard trope from those movies is a mysterious stranger seeking vengeance shows up in town. So spaghetti westerns are kind of European films made to copy American films, but they have a different twist to them, and I love them. I love the spaghetti westerns. And when we're talking about world cinema, I did want to mention Parasite, South Korean film, which won the Academy Award for Best Picture in 2020. It's an awesome film. If you haven't seen it, it's really quite awesome. And this got a lot of attention from people like myself and other people like, wow, you know, the American film industry actually, they didn't say this is the best foreign film. They said this is the best film of the year. Parasite, awesome film. Coming back to Bollywood for a minute, I just want to show this because I love Bollywood movies. That actor on the right is Amitabh Bachchan. The woman on the left is Zeenat Aman. Amitabh Bachchan, as of this recording, the day I'm recording this, the guy's still making movies. He's been making movies since the early 70s. He's made a number of unbelievably famous, spectacular, successful movies. And when you think about how famous and popular Bollywood movies are, not only in South Asia, but in Africa and other parts of the world, and Asia, this guy's like, you know, arguably, I would say the most famous film actor of all time. That's what I'm going to say. Not Tom Hanks, not Tom Cruise. I think it's Amitabh Bachchan when you look at the whole world. And he's still making movies right now. And if you've never seen a Bollywood movie with the dancing, I find it, you know, kind of interesting that they don't have like 3, 4, 5 background dancers. They will have like 30, 40, 50 background dancers. Very, very elaborate dance numbers. I'm showing you an image right here from a song. The film was Rocky or Ronnie. Kind of a newer Bollywood movie, but this gives you an image of what the Bollywood dance scenes are like. But I'm actually going to stop talking for a moment and play a little bit with the audio of a song called Choli Ke Piche. It's a song from the 1990s, and I think it is spectacularly good. I mean, I just think this is, you know, I can thought to say Hindi bolta hu. I can speak a little bit of Hindi, but even though I don't really understand what's going on here, I love it. When the woman sings, she's saying, what's behind my blouse? That's a rough translation. What's behind my blouse? She's thrusting her chest out very provocatively. The lyrics are, oh, it's a loving heart behind my blouse. That's what we call the art of the double meaning, right? You could say something very provocative, but then also, you know, kind of play, I'm innocent. What? It's just my loving heart behind my blouse. And to wrap things up, I want to talk about, or just throw a slide up here about the Nigerian film industry. I didn't know about Nollywood, right? If you got Bollywood from South Asia, Nollywood is what they call the film industry in Nigeria. I didn't even know this was a thing until I started doing research for this lecture. These films are popular not only in Nigeria, but, you know, everywhere as well. And lo and behold, you go to Netflix, there's a whole category for Nollywood films. And they're not just like one genre. There's different genres of Nollywood movies, Nollywood suspenseful movies, Nollywood thriller movies. The reason I'm putting this in, even though I don't really know and I'm not familiar with Nollywood movies, is just to encourage people to seek out things outside your comfort zone. You know, don't be afraid to watch a movie with a subtitle. You might learn something, you might be surprised, you might find something interesting that you could share with your friends and family. So the end. That's it for this video lecture. Hope you liked it.